My name is Marina Quinn. I served 22 years in the United States Army, 2 decades of diplomatic coordination, evacuation logistics, and negotiation in zones where silence could mean death. I've flown into chaos wearing sand-stained fatigues and left behind cities stitched together by temporary peace. But none of that prepared me for the day I walked through my parents' front door and heard my father say, "Maybe you should go back to base where someone still thinks you're useful." He didn't flinch when he said it. No greeting, no welcome, no sign that the girl who used to rebuild radios on the living room floor had ever mattered to him. I stood still, boots still damp from the Colorado sleet, holding a plain wooden box in my arms, souvenirs I thought might soften the distance, a jar of Turkish saffron, a folded Afghan scarf, a candle from a chapel in Poland that somehow always smelled like cedar. I had packed each item carefully. For my mother, for home. But they didn't even look at the box. They just looked through me. My sister was scrolling through her phone by the staircase, pretending I didn't exist. She used to call me her hero. Now she wouldn't meet my eyes. The kitchen still smelled of lemon polish and something sweet in the oven. But it was the kind of sweetness that sits on the surface like sugar over steel. It didn't belong to me anymore. That day I didn't slam the door or shout. I didn't ask why, because deep down I already knew. I wasn't a daughter returning. I was a stranger interrupting. And somewhere in that silence, the verdict was final. I hadn't planned to stay long, a weekend maybe. Just enough time to catch my breath before deciding where to land next. The Army had closed my final deployment with a quiet handshake and a thick envelope labeled transition brief. I was done. Officially. No more bases. No more night flights over hostile ground. No more waiting for coded messages to mean something life or death. I thought maybe, just maybe, home could be something again. But when I stepped inside, it was like I'd walked into a museum curated by strangers. The framed photos on the hallway shelf told their own story. My sister's graduation from Wharton, her wedding in Charleston, a ski trip in Aspen, her face everywhere beaming, centered, celebrated. The only photo of me was half hidden behind a dusty spice rack, the kind of placement you use when you can't decide whether to throw something away or pretend it never existed. No one said much. My mother asked if I wanted coffee, but her voice was clipped polite, in that way people speak to neighbors they don't quite trust. My father sat in his usual spot by the window, tapping through headlines on his tablet, like nothing unusual had walked through the door. He didn't even ask where I'd been stationed last. I could have said Antarctica, and he would have nodded and gone back to reading about stock prices. I asked about the house, new paint maybe? They said nothing. I mentioned I noticed the garden was gone. My mother shrugged. We didn't have time this year. Then changed the subject to my cousin Paul, who apparently just got hired at a hedge fund. Smart kid. He saw where the world was going. It wasn't even subtle. I'd been gone, yes. But I had sent money, enough to cover Mom's back surgery, enough to pay off the second mortgage, enough that I never expected gratitude, but I also didn't expect erasure. Still, I stayed for dinner. I shouldn't have, because that night something was taken from me. Not my place in the family I'd lost that years ago. What I lost was the illusion that it might still be waiting. Dinner was meatloaf, store-bought mashed potatoes, a bottle of wine my sister said she got from a client who owes her favors. No one asked if I drank. No one asked anything, really. I sat at the table like an invited guest who'd overstayed her welcome. The silverware didn't match, and the overhead light buzzed faintly, but what cut deeper than the imperfections was the way their eyes avoided mine, like looking at me too long might make something crack. Then I noticed it. The space in the garage was empty. I leaned back slightly and asked too softly, "Where's the GTO?" My father didn't even glance up from his plate. "Sold it last year." That car wasn't just metal. It was the summer I turned 17, me and him fixing it together, scraping our knuckles and laughing over oil stains. It was the only thing we ever built side by side. Did it at least go to someone who knew what they were getting, I asked. He shrugged. Didn't ask. It was just sitting there, just sitting there. I looked down at my plate, hands tightening under the table. My sister jumped in, smiling too brightly. I told them we should use the money for something practical, like upgrades for the wedding. Remember that roof leak last spring, I remembered? I'd wired them $8,000 that week. No one had said thank you. I assumed they were just busy. Now I realized they'd decided it was owed. The meatloaf suddenly tasted like dust. I excused myself and stood in the hallway, staring again at the wall of family photos. There was one of a yacht in Santorini, one of my parents on a cruise, one of Emily holding a glass of champagne mid-toast. I wasn't in any of them. Except one. Far left corner, crooked in the frame, a photo from my commissioning ceremony. I was in uniform saluting. My father's arm was around me. He looked stiff, like he wasn't sure why he was there. I stepped closer. Someone had drawn a faint crease across my face, maybe by accident. Maybe not. Either way, it told the truth. I didn't sleep that night. The guest room was still painted pale yellow, same curtains, same narrow bed, but it didn't feel familiar anymore. It felt staged, like a room left untouched to satisfy a polite obligation, like they expected I might visit one day, but not for long. Around 3 a.m., I packed quietly. The wooden box, my boots, the scarf they never asked about. I didn't leave a note. I figured they wouldn't read it anyway. By morning, I was at the Army lodging facility outside Denver. The place smelled like bleach and radiator heat, but at least it didn't smell like erasure. I signed in at the front desk. The corporal looked barely 20, bright-eyed, too polite. Room 214, Colonel Quinn. Just Marina, I corrected. She hesitated. Yes, ma'am. I carried my bag upstairs. The hallway was quiet. Linoleum floors, beige walls, vending machine humming at the end. Nothing special. But it felt honest. That evening, I sat alone in the mess hall. Metal trays, overcooked pasta. A few enlisted kids playing cards nearby, laughter echoing off the walls. I sipped weak coffee, trying not to think. Then a voice broke through the noise. Familiar, graveled, still carrying the dust of too many deployments. Well, hell. If it isn't Marina Quinn. I turned, slowly. Marcus Leland. We'd worked together in Kandahar. He looked older, more lines around the eyes, but the smirk was still there. You're still alive, I said, managing half a smile. He dropped into the seat across from me. That's what the VA keeps telling me. We didn't speak for a moment, just silence. The kind only shared by people who've both seen things they'll never explain. Then his tone shifted. You hear what's coming out of D.C.? I shook my head. They're planning a national broadcast. Presidential commendations for leadership under fire. High-level clearance stuff. I raised an eyebrow. Why are you telling me this? He met my gaze steady. Because rumor is, they're naming names, and one of them might be yours. I laughed, bitter, quiet. My family won't even name me at the dinner table. Marcus didn't blink. Then maybe it's time the whole damn country did. 2 days after that conversation with Marcus, the email came. The subject line was a single phrase, Theta Blue. Presidential recognition. Encrypted. Government seal. Clearance protocol embedded in the body text. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and reflex. I read it twice before I even moved. It wasn't just an invite. It was an assignment. A directive. The White House was staging a live national broadcast to honor classified contributors to national security and crisis response. Only a handful would be named publicly. The rest would remain anonymous, tucked into black files and buried citations. But they wanted to name me, not just by rank, by full name. I stared at the words, Major General Marina Quinn, Strategic Civilian Rescue Ops Northbridge Contingency. It was real. After all these years of working in the shadows, the country was about to bring me into the light. I didn't respond right away. I walked instead 3 full laps around the perimeter of the lodging facility, boots crunching against gravel wind biting through my coat. I thought about my father's voice. Go back to base. And I thought about what Marcus said. Let the whole damn country see you. So I accepted. They booked the flight, sent the dress uniform requisition, arranged a security escort from Reagan National to the holding facility outside the Capitol. I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister, not my parents. Especially not them. The night before I flew out, I watched CNN in the mess hall. A teaser aired between segments. Presidential broadcast to honor key figures in U.S. global stability, names to be revealed live. Somewhere in Colorado, I imagined my family flipping channels, sipping wine, adjusting their expectations of what mattered. I didn't pack anything from that house. No old photos, no secondhand warmth, just the wooden box, and my name, The name they used less and less until it didn't feel like mine. But tomorrow the world would hear it, spoken into a microphone, framed by a flag, echoed across every television in the country, not because I needed their approval, but because I'd earned it long before they stopped looking. The White House looked smaller in person, less myth, more marble. I arrived through the East Gate just after dawn. The holding room was silent, sterile, full of people not used to applause. A few wore uniforms, most wore nothing to mark their service, just quiet dignity, like they'd carried weight long enough not to show it anymore. I sat alone near the window, watching the sun edge across the south lawn. My hands didn't shake. Not from fear, at least, only from the weight of what it meant to be seen. At 10 sharp, a senior aide approached. General Quinn. "They're ready." He didn't ask if I was. The ballroom was flooded with light, golden trim, soft carpet, reporters clustered along the back, a podium framed by flags. I stepped in line behind two others, both older, both nodding silently as if to say we know. When the president entered the room, rose. He began to speak calm and measured a storyteller with nothing to sell. He spoke of crisis zones, an unseen labor of strategies that kept embassies from falling and civilians from becoming numbers. Then he paused. In times when leadership is tested not by title but by clarity, one individual stood firm. When others scattered, she steadied the line. He looked up. "Please welcome Major General Marina Quinn." The name landed like a slow-moving wave. Quiet, then thunderous. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged. Somewhere far away, I imagined my father's hand pausing mid-sip, my mother's expression stiffening as the living room filled with a name they hadn't said aloud in years. I walked forward. Dress blues crisp, medals polished but restrained, no need to shine what had already been earned. The president extended his hand, then the commendation, a star pinned directly above my heart. He leaned close, whispered so only I could hear. "Thank you for holding the line when it mattered most." I didn't cry, I saluted. The gesture sharp, unshaken, not for him, but for every unseen hour, for the civilians whose names wouldn't be called, for the ones who didn't make it home. When I stepped back, the applause didn't stop. It swelled through the room, through the screens, through every quiet place that once made me feel erased. And somewhere I hoped it passed through a house in Burlington. A house with a cracked photo frame, a father with a clenched jaw, a mother with no words, and a sister staring at a screen, wondering how she became a footnote in the story she once believed was hers. I didn't go back to Colorado, not that week, not ever. I flew to a quiet base just outside Alexandria and spent the night in a room meant for visiting officers, clean sheets, government-issue pillows, a lamp that buzzed faintly when turned too high. It was unremarkable, but it didn't lie. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. That morning, the news cycle had already shifted. Analysts were breaking down the president's speech, speculating which missions we'd been tied to, debating the ethics of declassifying partial truths for public morale. But one headline remained. Major General Marina Quinn, recognized in live White House ceremony, family declined to comment. I didn't give them the headline. I hadn't even mentioned them. But the press had done their job. Later that day, a mutual contact forwarded me a clipped recording from the local CBS affiliate in Burlington. The segment was only 37 seconds long. A reporter stood outside my parents' house microphone, angled slightly as she repeated her line. "The Quinn family has not issued a statement." The camera caught the front door closing. Fast, curt, final. I watched the clip once, then deleted it. That evening my phone buzzed. A private number. I let it ring. Then a text came through unsigned. "You looked strong. Emily, my sister. No apology, no punctuation. Just that." I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't reply. I wasn't angry, just tired. Some things don't need closure. They just need to stop. That weekend, a young cadet from a military prep school reached out through the department's mentoring network. She'd watched the broadcast, asked if I might have time to speak at their graduation next spring. I never saw anyone like me on TV before, she wrote. I agreed. Not for the cameras. For her. Because I remembered what it felt like to walk into a room and not be seen until someone important said your name out loud. They say recognition fades, but some echoes stay long after the applause ends. And in a house that once buried my photo behind the spice rack, silence now came with a different weight, not power, not regret, just the sound of something they could never take credit for. 3 weeks after the broadcast, I received an official summons from the Senate Armed Services Committee. Not for testimony, for recognition. They were holding a public session to review and acknowledge civilian evacuation protocols during covert operations, something we never talked about in public until now. I was asked to appear as a principal advisor. A formality, really. But in Washington, nothing is just formal. The hearing room smelled of cold air and leather-bound silence. Photographers clustered near the back, whispering about seating charts and sound bites. I wore my uniform again. Not for them, but for the girls in the back row, ROTC students in borrowed blazers trying to sit up straighter every time someone said leadership. Senator Harris called my name. I rose, answered each question cleanly. No dramatics, no grandstanding, just clarity. The kind I'd honed in field tents under dim floodlights, while missiles broke the sky in the distance. At one point, a younger senator leaned forward and asked General Quinn, "How did your family react to your recognition?" I paused. Not out of hesitation, but out of intention. "They didn't," I said simply. Murmurs, pen shifting, eyes narrowing. "And is that difficult?" he asked. I looked at him, then at the cadets in the back row. One of them had tears in her eyes. Another was biting her lip, fists clenched in her lap, like she didn't realize she was doing it. "It was," I said. But not anymore. No one spoke after that. They didn't need to. After the session, while walking down the steps of the Capitol, a girl about 16 stopped me. She wore a pressed blazer 2 sizes too big and carried a binder with hand-drawn stars on the cover. "You're the one they tried to ignore," she said. I blinked. She smiled just slightly, but the whole world saw you anyway. She handed me a folded letter and ran off before I could ask her name. Inside a sketch of a woman in uniform standing alone in the middle of a storm, boots planted head high, and underneath it a sentence written in bold ink, "If they never clap, clap for yourself." I tucked the letter into my chest pocket, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to remember how far silence could echo and how much louder stillness could be when you learned how to stand in it. I didn't chase headlines after that. Didn't sit for interviews. Didn't write a book or sign on for a speaking tour. I moved into a small brownstone near Alexandria, just a few blocks from the river. Mornings were quiet. I brewed my own coffee, walked the same route past the memorial wall every day. It became a kind of rhythm, unremarkable but real. I liked it that way. Eventually, I accepted a part-time role with Silent Shield, a nonprofit for female veterans transitioning out of service. We didn't talk about rank. We talked about housing trauma and how to fill out forms without shaking. We shared silence when words didn't fit. We clapped when someone said I slept through the night. It was more meaningful than any podium I'd stood behind. My family never called. The text from my sister remained unread in my phone, tucked beneath layers of updates and appointments. I never deleted it, but I never answered either. Some distances aren't bridged with words. Some are just left to stand. One evening, I walked past a small park just as the light dipped behind the trees. A little girl was playing with a plastic soldier, dragging it through the dirt like it had a mission. Her dad called her name Quinn. She didn't respond. He tried again, louder. "Quinn!" She looked up, smiled. Something in my chest tightened, then eased. That name, my name, meant something new now. Not a wound, not a warning, just a name again. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to reclaim it. I'd already done that. They never invited me to their table, so I built my own. With silence, steadiness, and a name spoken once on national television, and echoed quietly, gently by the people who mattered. Not out of pity, but out of recognition.